I'm speaking with Dr. Helen Caldicott. She's one of the world's leading spokespeople for the anti-nuclear movement. When I decided to run for Richmond for the Greens for the next federal election, that's when I really thought I want to speak to Helen Caldicott, because all I need is 5% of people to change their vote to win. And over 30 years ago, Helen nearly did it. We have agreed to purchase, so it seems, 6 nuclear submarines from the US. Why have we stopped talking about nuclear issues as vehemently as we used to? Because it clearly hasn't gone away. And what's your reaction to this submarine deal?
President Jefferson once said, "An informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion." And people are not very well informed. If they were, we'd have the same reaction as we had in the 70s to these blasted nuclear submarines.
Mandy Nolan has let Dr. Helen Caldicott misinform her fellow Richmond constituents. You're watching highlights of an online chat between Australian Green Party's Mandy Nolan and Dr. Helen Caldicott. Before this conversation took place, I warned Mandy she would need a real-time fact-checker when platforming Dr. Helen Caldicott. I showed Mandy video footage of Dr. Helen Caldicott misleading audiences with a painfully obvious hoax. I guess Mandy was unconcerned because no fact-checking took place during the event. So I am fact-checking now.
This submarine deal, can you explain to us, how do they work?
They have a nuclear reactor which produces the energy to run the submarine. All of America's aircraft carriers are nuclear powered. All of their submarines are nuclear powered. But America has 18 Trident submarines. On each submarine are 24 missiles. On each missile, 8 hydrogen bombs.
The submarine deal is for nuclear-powered subs, but not subs with nuclear weapons. Caldicott goes on about the destructive potential of American subs, but no one is talking about buying or selling subs armed with nuclear warheads. 3/4 of the Navy's nuclear-powered subs do not carry nuclear weapons.
But America has 18 Trident submarines.
Dr. Helen Caldicott is probably pivoting to nuclear weapons because the US Navy's safety record with their nuclear-powered subs is exemplary. They've operated nuclear-powered subs for 50 years without a single accident or a single negative impact on human health. In fact, nuclear submariners are exposed to less radiation than those of us living on the surface of the Earth.
So in total, America's got 3,456 hydrogen bombs.
In the talk, Caldicott goes on repeatedly about nuclear weapons. You know, I don't like nuclear weapons either, but lots of countries have nuclear power and no nuclear weapons. Lots of countries have nuclear weapons and no nuclear power. Do you know what keeps Australia from possessing nuclear weapons? Australians don't want them.
Why the hell do we want submarines anyway?
That would have been a great topic for discussion, but it was not to be.
It's ridiculous. What they're doing in America is obscene, and they're spending money, and we're involved in it now, on all sorts of weapon systems, and we're getting involved in it. Why are we fighting and killing?
Because the other go-to topic for Caldicott is men.
Why do men kill? Why do men kill? Women are nurturers. And that's why, Mandy, I'm supporting you.
Thanks, Helen.
Men have always fought and killed.
Yeah.
But we've got to stop killing now. We've got to stop killing. And we could stop killing and make friends with China and make friends with Indonesia and with France and all the other countries. Help to feed the people. In Yemen, the children are starving. You know, and there are billionaires flying up into space for no apparent reason, except to satisfy their testosterone requirements, I think. What we must do all together now is save life on this precious planet. And I think it seems we're the only life in the universe, and it's so magical.
If a nuclear sub was torpedoed, do you have any idea, how far would the damage spread, and would that then cause a nuclear catastrophe?
Not a nuclear catastrophe. You wouldn't get an explosion or anything, but the reactor would obviously be damaged and burst, and all the isotopes would get into the sea.
So this is war, right? This question is being asked in the context of Australia being at war. Whether it's an atomic war or a conventional war, the war is going to be your concern, not one torpedoed submarine. But if an Australian nuclear submarine was hit, what would be the likely outcome? No radiation being released. Why is that? Because the submarine is very big, and the small modular reactors providing power to the sub are very, very small. The reactor would need to be cracked by the torpedo's explosion to release any radioactive material. It is possible, but it's just not a very likely outcome.
We'll be the only country in the world to have a nuclear-powered submarine without a nuclear power industry.
That is true. Australia has never decided to replace coal with nuclear power, but Australia does produce life-saving medical isotopes in their Opal research reactor. Australia already saves lives at home and around the world with nuclear medicine, and it's a valuable export. Australia does have a nuclear industry. It's just not a nuclear power industry.
Subs are actually going to be built in America, in Connecticut, not here.
The nuclear subs are going to be constructed in the city of Adelaide. The French subs, which Australia is not buying anymore, those were going to be constructed in India.
So I guess what everyone's asking is this the gateway to nuclear power?
Well, I mean, you don't know, because Morrison lies the whole time and his national cabinet meetings are now held in secrecy. I wouldn't trust the man as far as I could kick him.
Nuclear power is illegal in Australia, just like it was in Kentucky, Wisconsin, Montana, and West Virginia in the United States. Prominent liberals started to support nuclear power.
Trying to get rid of all the nuclear power plants that produce 20% of the nation's energy is not going to help us accomplish our goals.
Right now, nuclear is more than 50% of our non-carbon causing energy. Most Americans don't realize that. They really don't, and I was one of them. People who think that we can get there without nuclear being part of the blend just aren't looking at the facts.
I think it's natural to re-examine your beliefs as you age up. Nuclear is the best way to go for energy for the future.
You and I are religious fanatics, or have been, about anti-nuclear. Nuclear is bad, and we are the ones who should lead the discussion.
I remember the intensity of the nuclear debate, and I was on the other side of it.
This administration does not support the Department of Energy's Advanced Liquid Metal Reactor program and will oppose any efforts to continue the funding for this reactor project.
But given this challenge we face today, and given the progress of fourth-generation nuclear, go for it. No other alternative. Zero emissions.
We all know that there isn't 4 hours of sun here in Michigan every day, and so on those days there's no sun. How am I warming up my pizza?
People learned about nuclear power from accurate sources, and they simply changed their minds.
It feels illogical and insane to be, and there's no democracy involved in this.
So I'm not a sub guy, I'm not a military guy, but how this conversation misses some really obvious points is beyond me. First of all, those diesel subs France was supposed to be building for Australia were way behind schedule. The naval group in charge was hacked, and the capabilities of the diesel subs were exposed to adversaries. The cost of the French diesel subs was supposed to be 56 billion Australian dollars, but the French had been increasing the cost to 90 billion.
There's no democracy involved in this.
Does this change in supplier really need a democratic consultation? These are better submarines. These subs have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. And assuming Australia does need submarines, these will be delivered faster as well. Does Australia need new submarines? I have no idea. But these are more capable submarines.
There's no democracy involved in this. Because
it's evil. It's evil because it's about killing. Thou shalt not kill. And the whole thing is about killing. War is about killing.
You often hear them talking about, that's new technology, it's so safe now, as if humans were never fallible, as if we weren't then, the planet was unstable. How can we navigate the accident?
The biggest energy accident in human history was the Bankwai Dam in China. 250,000 people dead. I'm sure you've never heard of it. That hydro accident killed 40 times more people than Chernobyl radiation and the Fukushima evacuation combined. The most deaths which can be attributed to energy supply are from coal. Coal kills 1 million people every year. Nuclear power is statistically one of the safest forms of energy production. But, whatever. Which brings me to a question you, the viewer, might be asking. No, I'm not Australian. I'm Canadian. But I did see Crocodile Dundee once as a kid, so I think I know where y'all are coming from. Actually, there's way more to it than that. I will tell you later in the video. Mate.
What are the kind of health risks for a community that lives near waste?
Of course, the simplest thing to do with used fuel is to do what's already being done at the WIP. Store it in a deep geological repository. The WIP is in the United States and it's been receiving used fuel for over 20 years.
What they do with these highly radioactive rods, if you stand near them for a couple of seconds, you'll get a lethal dose and die.
The radioactivity of used fuel drops rapidly once it is removed from the reactor. If you stood next to used fuel which had just been pulled from an operating reactor, yes, you could get a lethal dose. But used fuel doesn't get yanked out of a reactor and sent immediately to storage. First of all, it sits in a cooling pool. It stays there until its radioactivity has decreased enough to transport. Nuclear workers move fuel regularly. They just don't do it when the fuel is that radioactive.
You'll get a lethal dose and die. They melt them in concentrated nitric acid. They remove the plutonium, which is the fuel for nuclear weapons. You only need 5 kilos to make a bomb.
Plutonium is created in power reactors. Plutonium is created in military reactors. But those two plutoniums are quite different. For example, plutonium-238 was the very first isotope of plutonium discovered and cannot be used to make a bomb. We use it in radioisotope thermoelectric generators. Apollo astronauts use plutonium RTGs to power their science equipment. The Mars rovers Curiosity and Opportunity are entirely powered by RTGs, enabling a wider array of power-hungry experiments and improved mobility that Spirit and Opportunity just never had. Well-powered Curiosity and Perseverance exploring Mars and these spectacular images are all courtesy of plutonium-238. Within each element, there can be different members, each one having the same number of protons but differing in the number of neutrons. The total of an atom's protons and neutrons is its atomic weight. These different members of the same element are what science calls isotopes. Tin, for instance, has a great many isotopes. Others, like aluminum, have just one. These are the plutonium isotopes found in spent fuel rods. There's plutonium-238. NASA has almost run out of 238, and they're working really hard to try to make more.
I salute you.
But if you're Dr. Evil,
this organization will not tolerate failure.
You want plutonium-239. In fact, you need 90% of the plutonium to be 239 for it to be weapons grade. You also need to keep plutonium-240 below 7%. 240 spontaneously fissions. That's a showstopper.
Sorry, I farted.
Are we choosing between space exploration and nuclear weapons here? No.
Each reactor makes 500 pounds of plutonium a year. You only need 10 pounds to make a nuclear weapon. So you get the plutonium, which is great because you can make bombs with it.
This is incorrect. Plutonium from spent fuel is not suitable for either purpose. We won't power space probes with it, we won't fuel Mars rovers with it, and no one is going to build a bomb out of it. The only practical use for that plutonium is to be recycled into new nuclear fuel and release the remaining 95% of the energy still trapped inside it. That is its only practical use.
The plutonium, which is the fuel for nuclear weapons, you only need 5 kilos to make a bomb.
A power reactor creates plutonium which is not weapons grade. Weapons grade plutonium is created in military reactors. Of the 16,000 nuclear warheads on the planet today, not a single one was created from civilian energy production. Dr. Helen Caldicott is not sharing the fact that plutonium created in power reactors contains too much 240 and too little 239. Power reactor plutonium is not weapons grade.
And why we want our plutonium removed, God only knows.
Reprocessing spent fuel lets us use it again as fuel. Only 5% of spent fuel, which we will refer to as used fuel, is truly spent. The vast majority of it can be used to create even more carbon-free energy. In Canada, where I live, we'll be using a Moltex molten salt reactor, which lets us recycle our used nuclear fuel into more clean energy. And this process also makes it easier to store the actually used up fuel, the truly spent fuel, because it will be radioactive for far less time.
They want to build a radioactive waste facility at Napandee, and I'm sure it's sort of an open door for bringing back the world's radioactive waste. No one knows what to do with it. There are thousands of tons of this highly toxic stuff, which must be stored from the ecosphere for 1 million years, according to the Environmental Protection Agency in America.
If we reprocess everything and we completely close the nuclear fuel cycle, then you only have to store that used waste for 1,000 years. This was Dr. Helen Caldicott's response to that idea.
And fast reactors fission plutonium, and the fission products like cesium and strontium and others, they last for 600 years. Like, duh? Oh, well, that's a good way to get rid of plutonium that lasts for 500,000 years. It's only 600 years. And they're toxic as hell, they're carcinogenic as hell.
Yeah, they're dangerous and radioactive materials that won't be dangerous and radioactive in 1,000 years.
Oh, well, that's a good way to get rid of plutonium that lasts for 500,000 years. It's only 600 years.
1,000,000 years is a long time to you or me, but that is nothing in geological time frame. In fact, 2 billion years ago, there were natural nuclear reactors. We found the remains of 17 in the Gabon. The reactors are no longer operating, but we can see how seawater washed into a cave and enabled natural uranium to start splitting in an energy-creating chain reaction. It happened 1.7 billion years ago, when there was still only ocean-based life. That 1.7 billion years gives us a real-world test of how nuclear waste was stored in a natural geological repository. The plutonium created by the reactor has moved 2 meters since the chain reaction first took place, almost 2 billion years ago. By the time our sun expires, the plutonium will have spread 5 more meters through the rock. In 2 billion years, that plutonium has barely moved, and what was dangerously radioactive when the reactors are running stopped being radioactive a long time ago. Now that's just random geology, not a carefully selected area designed to last 2,000 times longer than it should ever need to contain the radioactive material. Compare that to coal. Coal waste does not go in a container. It's shat directly into the air we breathe. It needs to be shat into the air because coal creates 200,000 times more waste than nuclear for the same amount of energy. And with advanced nuclear, coal would be producing 6 million times the waste. If Caldicott wanted to limit our impact on the environment, she'd be celebrating how concentrated nuclear power is and how easy it is to store. Mercury is a toxic substance. It too can be stored in a geologic repository. In fact, that is something we do in Canada. We take mercury, stick it deep underground, and call it a day. The difference between mercury and nuclear waste is that mercury is toxic forever. Literally forever. Nuclear waste is not. Coal production kills 1 million people every single year. Used nuclear fuel from civilian power reactors has never harmed a single person anywhere, ever, nowhere on the entire planet.
Nuclear waste, the worst type of garbage for raccoons to get into.
Military nuclear waste, now that has harmed people. There's lots of examples of shoddy disposal. But civilian power reactor waste, that has never harmed anyone. And I don't expect that it ever will. I would happily live on top of a deep geological repository with my family. That is a nothing burger. What would harm my family, and does harm my family, is coal combustion, polluting the air we breathe. In fact, one of the reasons I'm fact-checking Dr. Helen Caldicott all the way here from Canada is because she's visited my country repeatedly to lie about nuclear power.
In effect, you're exporting cancer, genetic disease, congenital deformities. In Canada, your two major exports are wheat and uranium. You sell life and you sell death.
Those are not at all Canada's two biggest exports. Caldicott visited Canada's province of Ontario and convinced Dr. Chris Kiefer that nuclear power was bad.
You're all fools. What do you think you're doing? I mean, you all need psychoanalysis.
She went on at length about, how thick the containment was and how much concrete and steel would be used. She never provided any infographics or sourced literature to back up the claim. But it did stick in my head, and only within the last 2 or 3 years did I look at better evidence and see that that was a wholly untrue claim.
And just to be clear, those are life cycle emissions. So when Helen Caldicott would say,
A nuclear power plant will produce the same amount of CO2 in toto as a gas-fired plant, so you may as well just use gas.
life cycle emissions means that's all factored into these numbers.
It's easy maybe to make the very minor mistake of saying that nuclear is emissions free. I mean, certainly at the point of production, when you're splitting those atoms and putting electricity on the grid, there's zero CO2 emissions occurring at that moment. There's no air pollution, but steel making is carbon intensive, concrete making is carbon intensive. That all contributes to that number.
Then Caldicott visited my home province of Alberta and my home city, Calgary. She came because Alberta was considering building nuclear power plants to replace our coal combustion.
A reactor can't operate without continuously emitting radiation into the environment, and you'll use 4 million gallons a minute of cooling water, and it goes back into your lake or river, relatively radioactive.
Caldicott succeeded in scaring Albertans away from nuclear power, once again by lying about it. We have been burning coal ever since. Thanks, Helen.
They want to build a radioactive waste facility at Napandee, and I'm sure it's sort of an open door for bringing back the world's radioactive waste. No one knows what to do with it. There are thousands of tons of this highly toxic stuff, which must be stored from the ecosphere for 1 million years, according to the Environmental Protection Agency in America. And as it leaks, and it's leaking already now, it leaks into the streams and the water.
What is leaking? What's she even talking about? Caldicott never clarifies.
What happens if you eat a fish with strontium-90 and they're about to tip hundreds of tons of radioactive water into the Pacific at Fukushima? Fish swim thousands of miles. You can't taste the strontium-90 or cesium-137 in the fish.
Caldicott is conflating two things. Thing one, some Fukushima water is about to be released into the Pacific. But that water is lightly contaminated with tritium, not cesium. You could drink the Fukushima water directly. The tritium is so dilute. Thing two. In 2011, the Fukushima accident released some strontium-90 and a bunch of other radioactive isotopes.
What can be done at Fukushima as far as rehabilitation?
Good question. Nothing. They will never, ever clean it up.
5 days before Caldicott participated in Mandy Nolan's Zoom conversation, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration announced that even food produced and caught right next to Fukushima does not pose any food safety risk. What could they do about Fukushima Daiichi itself? They could build a new, safer reactor right next to the useless old one. Any modern reactor would have easily survived the combination of human error and pump-in-the-basement engineering mistakes which allowed Fukushima Daiichi to melt down in the first place. Fukushima was bad, but not as bad as most people seem to think. Many people conflate the tsunami death toll with an imagined radiation death toll.
We want to clarify a story we brought you Thursday.
Our Canadian Broadcasting Corporation made this common mistake and then issued a correction.
Nearly 20,000 people died, but we want to make it clear those deaths happened as a result of the quake and tsunami, not the nuclear meltdown that followed after waves hit the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
2,313 people were killed by an evacuation of a preposterously large area. Japan, having directly experienced Fukushima, is recommitting to nuclear power. Japan tried to power their country without nuclear and ended up importing and combusting fossil fuel.
There's been a big increase in thyroid cancer.
While increased testing around Fukushima did uncover more thyroid cancers than pre-Fukushima levels of testing, there was not an increase in thyroid cancers in the population. That's according to a March 2021 report. Dr. Helen Caldicott does not mention this report to Mandy, nor does she ever mention it to anyone. Helen only mentions cancer briefly to Mandy as a short lie. I'm going to play a different clip of Dr. Helen Caldicott to show you how she misleads on the subject of cancer.
Germany did a classic study living less than 5K from 16 reactors. Incidence of leukemia was more than double normal. That study was then duplicated by the French. So they don't need to do another study.
There were follow-up studies. German nuclear power plants were built on pre-contaminated sites. One was built where a chemical factory used to be. This curious finding was then explored further in a UK study which saw elevated leukemia rates where nuclear power plants were planned but had not been constructed. New studies, which account for confounding factors, find no link between leukemia and nuclear power plant operation.
Incidence of leukemia was more than double normal.
There's been a big increase in thyroid cancer.
They don't need to do another study.
Dr. Helen Caldicott ignores all studies, all evidence that challenge her position on any aspect of nuclear power.
I wrote a book called Nuclear Madness years and years ago, and I said that radioactive waste will induce epidemics of cancer, leukemia, genetic disease, and congenital deformities for the rest of time, not just in humans, but animals and plants.
Dr. Helen Caldicott has a 1955 understanding of the effects of radiation on humans. She believes radiation is the primary cause of mutation based on the work of Robert Muller. Muller blasted fruit flies with massive doses of radiation.
Their lowest dose was like 100 to 1,000 X-rays. That's not a low dose. X-rays today are pretty mild, but in 1946 you had to expose film, not a silicon chip. 1,000 X-rays is what they were doing in 3.5 minutes. Imagine if you sat through 1,000 1946 X-rays in 3.5 minutes. Despite his experiments having a very limited range of strengths of radiation that the fruit flies were exposed to, he extrapolated down to zero radiation in a way that is called a linear no threshold, meaning that there is damage done to organisms no matter how little the radiation is until you reach no radiation.
It's based on the assumption that radiation will harm you at whatever degree to whatever degree you're exposed. It is established in regulation, yet there is no epidemiological data to back that up. There is no study that says we have taken a cohort of people and we've exposed them to 1% more radiation than normally would get, and we've seen 1% more cancer. In fact, there are many places in the world where background levels of radiation are substantially higher than they are for regular places. If the linear no threshold hypothesis was in fact true, or even approaching truth, you would see statistically significantly higher levels of cancer in those populations, those cohorts. But what happens? Not only is there not higher levels of cancer, there are actually suppressed levels of cancer.
Kasperi found no support for the linear model, but actually found support for a threshold. And this was in a very large study with the most sophisticated advancements in methodology, and also at by far the lowest dose rate that had ever been tested. So it was, at that point, the best test for a low dose effect.
Kasperi dug in, and Kasperi wanted to see, well, was he right or was he wrong? And so Kasperi got much unpublished data from Muller himself.
Muller writes back on November 12th. This is the smoking gun. He writes back on November 12th and said he got it. He kind of scanned the whole thing. He looked at it. He saw the data. The data actually conflicted with his linear paradigm. It was very disturbing. The study has to be replicated. He knew the story, and he had been a consultant all the way through as well. He knew the implications. He knew that it was the best study to date. But what did he do? He just threw it under the bus.
He was asked to give testimony to the National Academy of Sciences regarding the effects of radiation.
He basically makes the claim that one can no longer accept the belief that there is a threshold relationship. He says that, we have to accept a linear perspective.
Now, you can call that lying, you can call that mischievous, you can call it anything you want, but it wasn't being honest.
Mueller argued that if you get 1/10 the dose, you have 1/10 the chance of developing cancer. Today we know Mueller made his announcement by ignoring evidence to the contrary, distorting data, and avoiding the peer review process. Mueller and Caldicott, a match made in heaven.
Learned about Muller, who irradiated Drosophila fruit fly and produced genetic abnormalities passed on generation to generation. So I understood what radiation did. No dose is safe. You never need your teeth x-rayed except if you've got an abscess. Don't get your breasts x-rayed every 2 years. No, they don't understand how radiation causes cancer. They don't know that each dose they receive causes cancer. Have pictures of fetal defects and deformed babies and all the rest. I mean, make it come home.
So the linear no threshold model basically states that there is no safe dose of radiation. In all other areas of toxicology, there are thresholds, and the dose makes the poison. If you jump off of a 100-foot cliff, it's probably going to kill you. But if you jump off of a 1-foot ledge 100 times, that's not going to kill you. I don't give much weight at all to very low doses having a relevant health impact. I don't believe that the linear no threshold is the best model to assess risk from low levels of radiation.
So I can't understand why the AMA, American Medical Association, the American Cancer Association, isn't saying close down the reactors.
Medicine has really changed fundamentally in how we make decisions about what is true or what's the reason that a treatment works or does it work or not work. And that used to be very much based on what was called a mechanistic worldview, which was, the heart is a pump, the valves function that same way, and you move blood like this. And so, or, on a molecular, there's a mechanism for this molecule to do this thing. And therefore, okay, it should work. The standard of evidence shifted to something called evidence-based medicine now, where we need to do large population-based studies, randomized, controlled, double-blinded, multi-center studies to actually prove something so we can get rid of all the potential biases that may be producing a falsely positive result or saying that a treatment does or doesn't work. And that really predates Caldicott's training. And she loves to bandy about, listen, like, I'm a pediatrician. I've worked in this field for this long. I'm the expert, real appeal to authority in a lot of her argumentation.
How dare anyone question our medical credentials? If I lied in medicine, I would be deregistered. If I lied in medicine, I would be deregistered. And I'm not boasting, but I'm a very good doctor. I came second in my year of medicine. I don't say things that are inaccurate. Otherwise, I would be deregistered. I mean, doctors can't lie.
Being a doctor trained in the 60s and 70s is very different than being a doctor trained now in terms of how we assess the evidence and the medical evidence and our ability to actually engage with reports like the Chernobyl Forum or the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation reports. You need a good knowledge of epidemiology and statistics and critical appraisal to be able to assess the validity of one competing bit of literature with another.
That's a really good insight. Thanks for pointing that out, because I had never ever considered that she was an older doctor rather than a younger doctor.
There's older doctors that have kept up with the literature and have educated themselves in the tools of evidence-based medicine, but it's a slog, man. That's a big part of medical training these days. Every week we would be doing critical appraisals of the medical literature and looking at these exact issues of, is the methodology sound? What's the quality of this study? What are the potential biases and flaws? That's something that I think scientists do and have done for a long time, but that is fairly new to medicine. Null hypothesis, scientific method thing where you're constantly assuming you're wrong and then sort of proving your way out of that. And that finally arrived at medicine, I'd say, in the early 2000s. So that's something that Dr. Caldicott is not as well versed in. And certainly, that's making a bold statement, but I'm basing that on, statements that she's made, which demonstrate a profound illiteracy in research methodology.
Sunlight is a form of radiation. You can absorb 1 hour of sunlight every day for a week and not get a sunburn.
Dad, you're kind of red.
That's a good base.
If you absorb sunlight for 7 hours straight, you will get a very bad burn. That burn will lead to an increase in the chances of you getting skin cancer, far more so than not getting a burn by being exposed 1 hour every day for a week. That's why, despite Fukushima exposing some Japanese children to very small quantities of iodine-131, and Caldicott predicting a massive wave of child thyroid cancers, there was no increase at all. What appears to be true, and there's a great deal of evidence to support this, there seems to be some threshold, where above the threshold, you receive too much radiation and it will harm you. Below the threshold, there is no discernible effect. If you drink 1 shot of whiskey a day for a month, You'll be fine, you'll live to tell the tale. Take 30 shots of whiskey in one day, and you could die. Radiation is like that. Only hear one little tiny soundbite from Dr. Helen Caldicott, you only be a little bit misinformed. Listen to 1 full hour of Mandy Nolan talking to Dr. Helen Caldicott, and you will go insane. Radiation is like that.
Radioactive waste will induce epidemics of cancer, leukemia, genetic disease, and congenital deformities for the rest of time.
Civilian-used nuclear fuel has never harmed a single person on Earth. No one, anywhere, ever. Chernobyl radiation did harm people, but not in a way Caldicott describes. We know 57 people died because Chernobyl exposed them to massive quantities of radiation. Probably 4,000 people will have their lives shortened due to Chernobyl radiation. 4,000 people in total. It's not a running tally. We know the human impact of Chernobyl ends because everything radioactive eventually ceases to be radioactive. In particular, radioactive iodine released from Chernobyl is no longer radioactive. It was only dangerous for about a month. And when Caldicott says the accident resulted in genetic defects humans are going to carry forward forever, no, that didn't happen. Enough time has passed that we would know if it was happening, and it is not happening. Dr. Helen Caldicott still holds the title of doctor. I don't and never have. But I can read United Nations scientific reports. Caldicott has made sky-is-falling claims about Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. None of them have panned out.
Japan is, by orders of magnitude, many times worse than Chernobyl.
She's been wrong every time. Before Mandy platformed Caldicott, I sent her this video. Mandy Nolan, be aware of Dr. Helen Caldicott's inaccurate statements before you platform her.
Certainly, I think more people have died from Chernobyl than in the Black Plague.
The WHO put Chernobyl's death toll at 4,000. The Black Plague killed 25 million people. Caldicott is off by 3 orders of magnitude.
A nuclear power plant will produce the same amount of CO2 in toto as a gas-fired plant, so you may as well just use gas.
IPCC puts natural gas at 40 times the greenhouse gas emissions as nuclear.
Germany did a study, 16 reactors. Incidence of leukemia was more than double normal.
German nuclear power plants were built on pre-contaminated sites. One was built where a chemical factory used to be.
They don't need to do another study.
New studies accounting for confounding factors find no link between leukemia and nuclear power plant operation. I could go on, but to be brief, the single most egregious falsehood propagated by Dr. Helen Caldicott,
And I've got a fallout from Fukushima,
is her claim that this is a fallout map created by the Australian Radiation Service.
This is the nuclear fallout released by the Australian Radiation Service. The ambient levels in Seattle went up 40,000 times above normal.
She's been showing it to audiences for years. It was debunked by Snopes immediately. In 2011, right after Fukushima, ARS issued a statement saying they did not create it. I've got an email from them myself clarifying that they did not create it. It shows 750 rads hitting America's west coast. That would kill half the population and make the other half violently ill. This wasn't a hoax designed to fool medical professionals, yet Dr. Helen Caldicott continued to attribute it to ARS and even claimed its contents had come to pass.
And this was the potential fallout, which has actually come to pass. So here's Japan, and here are you.
As if 750 rads had actually hit the west coast. Reputable news outlets no longer trust her commentary. Australian Independent is the last mainstream news outlet to feature her. Their editor has openly bragged about it having been an anti-nuclear publication. Caldicott is only found in Independent Australia and Sputnik News and Russia Today. Please do not join these 3 remaining organizations in helping to spread Dr. Helen Caldicott's misinformation. I also told her that Dr. Ben Hurd would be willing to fact-check Caldicott in real time if she needed an Australian subject matter expert to weigh in.
Recycling and doing it properly is an energy-intensive enterprise.
No response from Mandy Nolan.
We're in a paradox. We want to do something better for the environment, but the process of doing it is worse for the environment. Nuclear power, nuclear fission breaks the paradox. We can have as much energy as we want, actually, and then deploy it in a range of incredibly beneficial uses like recycling metals, recycling paper, recycling plastic. There are literally mountains of resources all over the world.
The live stream conversation went ahead. They took softball questions from the chat room. I fact-checked in real time, and my corrections were ignored. That's why this moment is so delightful.
President Jefferson once said, "An informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion." And people are not very well informed.
But anyway, when Caldicott shows this childlike hoax, she's got a credibility problem. When Caldicott says Chernobyl killed more people
than in the Black Plague,
she might as well be declaring the moon is made of cheese.
There are psychologists in the Department of Energy in America trying to work out what signs to put on the radioactive storage facilities.
Because, yeah.
For the next million years.
She almost said a true thing there, except for the number part.
We live in a land, a continent blown by the wind, ablazed by the sun, geothermal energy in the north of South Australia. We could become the energy superpower, the renewable energy superpower of the world. Leave the coal in the ground, stop getting out natural gas, which is 88 times more potent as a global warmer than CO2. How dare we? And we could do it now and create huge numbers of jobs and show the world how to proceed into the future.
Ontario actually did both. That's a Canadian province which stopped burning coal. They built out renewables, and they refurbished their nuclear power plants to make them more powerful. And what they found was the cheapest carbon-free energy source was hydro. Then came nuclear, then came wind, and the most expensive carbon-free energy source was solar power. Why was nuclear cheaper than wind and solar? Because wind and solar are intermittent. You can swap in nuclear to replace coal because it's dependable. You can't swap in wind and solar, they're not dependable. If you could swap in solar and wind to replace coal, Germany would be low carbon.
Here is a picture of a simulation of supply meeting demand. The year is 2010, so that is actual demand across the top line for 2010. The supply underneath has been modelled from renewable energy sources by Elliston, Diesendorf, McGill in order to demonstrate that it could be met using renewable sources only. With wind, this mountain-type profile here is the coming and going of wind generation over this 7-day period. The dark blue here represents solar PV. The yellow here is concentrating solar thermal with storage. Blue is the hydro, which leaves this fellow here, and that's biomass.
The National Electricity Market of Australia is famously the largest grid in the world in terms of its geographic spread. It's famously long and skinny. It's laid out with centralised nodes of generation, close to centres of demand. The current plan is for a dramatically different system. Generation would depart those nodes and move towards nominated renewable energy zones, both distant from the grid and distant from the demand. The renewable energy zones are focused on where the renewable energy resource is good. So making this work necessitates a transmission network on an altogether different scale than we have today, a renewable supply-driven system. I think that process is going to be very difficult and has many uncertainties to it.
Show the world how to proceed into the future.
Great.
Mandy, that's your remit.
That's what we'll be doing.
You're elected.
Exactly. I mean, that is the future. And you're going, it just seems, nuclear power seems, it's completely unsustainable. And we're looking at, I guess we've got to broaden how we look at zero emissions to look at the entire footprint of an energy. And the footprint of nuclear
is 12 grams. IPCC median value carbon emission for nuclear is 12 grams per kilowatt hour. That's on par with wind at 11 grams and kicking solar's ass. An even newer study was published by the United Nations looking at European energy life cycles. Nuclear comes in at 6 grams. That's the lowest by far. Another study shows Canadian nuclear power, that's my own country's nuclear power, at 3.2 grams. That's what Dr. Helen Caldicott helped ruin for my province of Alberta, one of the lowest carbon energy sources on the entire planet. And Dr. Helen Caldicott came to my province to tell us that nuclear power has the same carbon emissions as burning gas. She said we might as well just burn gas.
I guess we've got to broaden how we look at zero emissions to look at the entire footprint of nuclear.
The imagining that some carbon-intensive process was excluded from all these life cycle studies. What about the mining of uranium? What about the decommissioning of the plant? Oh heavens no, no one ever thought of that. Only Mandy and Helen are sharp enough to think of these things.
To say that nuclear is clean is just a pathological aberration.
That's the push from the industry,
It's
though,
going to
Helen.
produce epidemics of disease for the rest of time. How dare they say it's clean?
The used nuclear fuel is contained. It can be recycled. In some countries, it's already being recycled. No one has ever been harmed by civilian nuclear waste. There is no other energy source that has a waste stream that is completely contained. Even geothermal can create radioactive waste. What do you think geothermal is? It's the radioactive decay of uranium and thorium in the Earth's crust.
Our planet, our society, and we ourselves are built of star stuff.
Now, two of the things that were created in supernova are thorium and uranium. These were different because they were radioactive, and they kept some of that energy from the supernova explosion stored in their very nuclear structure. And some of this thorium and uranium was incorporated into our planet, sinking to the center of the world and heating our planet.
The decay of radioactive elements in the core keeps it moving.
When you tap into geothermal, you can release radioactive byproducts. California's Imperial Valley releases 200 times the volume of radioactive waste as a nuclear power plant does for the same amount of electricity. Same with coal. In Canada, if we switched every single coal plant to a nuclear plant, except for one, that one coal plant would expose Canadians to more radiation than all the operating nuclear plants combined.
And also the process of uranium mining, enrichment, building the reactor, decommissioning the reactor, storing the radioactive waste produces huge amounts of CO2. How dare they say? And, I think for men, E=mc² is a big turn on.
The IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says that solar emits 4 times as much carbon as nuclear power. Those are life cycle numbers.
E=mc² is a big turn on. Pentagon talks about having a nuclear war as one big orgasmic wump. I mean, they use these terminologies in front of women even. Soft laydown, deep penetration, hard lines and soft lines. It's all sexual.
Yeah, it's very sexualized, isn't it? Well, it's all got the rapey feel of rapey feel of domination.
Yeah.
Of an unwilling population.
Sex comes into it. All these men operate from their reptilian midbrains and use their left cortex to justify what their emotions want them to do. And a lot of it's about testosterone. I'm fed up with testosterone. E=mc² is a substitute probably for male, will I say it? Erection and ejaculation. And they like it. And it's this sort of energy that really grabs them.
But that's why I want to get in this seat, is because if we could get a minority government with, with Adam Banton and I on, on the crossbench. Yep. That's when you can get real change happening, because it's just not going to happen as it stands. The other question is here. There's another one that says, it's a question I saw come up this week as well, was what are your thoughts on thorium-based nuclear power?
Spoiler alert, neither Mandy nor Caldicott will mention China's thorium molten salt reactor.
Thorium is not naturally fissionable. So you dig it up out of the ground and you have to mix it with highly enriched uranium or plutonium, and it then fissions, producing uranium-232, I think.
Here's an explanation by Kirk Sorensen.
Thorium is a naturally occurring radioactive substance found just about everywhere on this planet. We have lots and lots of thorium, and it has some unique properties. One of them is
if you hit thorium with a neutron, the thorium will absorb the neutron and it will turn from thorium-232 into thorium-233. It's going to decay into protactinium-233, and then it will decay over about a month to uranium-233. Uranium-233, if you hit it with a neutron, it will fission. In addition to releasing all that energy, it will release 2 or 3 additional neutrons. All right, so you need one of those neutrons to go find another thorium, and you need another one of those neutrons to find another uranium-233 to continue the reaction. You're fissioning uranium-233, but you're making a new one. But you can almost think about it as a pseudo-catalyst. If you had some uranium-233, you could catalyze the burning of thorium indefinitely.
And then you have to take that fuel and reprocess it from the thorium reactor, melt it down in concentrated nitric acid.
You do not have to melt down the fuel
to remove this new uranium you've created.
Dr. Helen Caldicott has been incorrectly stating this since I first learned about thorium in 2009, when I discovered 4 Google Tech Talks on the subject.
Dr. Joe Borrometti.
I have a lot of material to go over.
Today's speaker is Robert Hargraves.
Probability of making plutonium in that kind of reactor is much, much less.
Our speaker today, Dr. David LeBlanc.
I have a lot to talk to you about today. I'm going to go fairly fast.
Today we have Kirk Sorensen.
The potential energy that's in thorium is really staggering.
Every single one made clear the practical way to convert thorium into energy was in liquid form, by dissolving the fuel in molten salt. There are no fuel rods involved at all.
In fluid form, you can get past a lot of the drawbacks of using thorium.
Any use in solid fuels, involves very difficult fuel processing. First thing is that the fuel is in a liquid form. It means that the chemical processing is relatively easy to accomplish.
The expandability of the fluid gives you a large negative temperature coefficient, which is where your safety is at.
You do not have to melt down the fuel. You do not have to use
concentrated nitric acid
to remove the uranium. This is because the fuel is already liquid. Thorium reactor is short for thorium molten salt reactor. The fuel is dissolved in molten salts instead of existing as ceramic fuel pellets.
The molten salt fuel for this reactor is radically different. Salt flows from a pipe which is heated to keep the salt molten. At 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, the salt does not react with air. It flows like water, but does not boil.
This allows chemical processing to take place. You cannot apply this chemistry to a solid fuel pellet. You can apply chemistry to a molten salt liquid. Hearing Dr. Helen Caldicott still describe a thorium reactor as something which requires the melting of solid fuel, that is nuts. For over a decade, thorium advocates have been repeatedly clarifying these reactors use liquid fuel.
People recycle cans, they recycle papers. Why not candles? I say we put a bin out and let people bring back their old drippings at their convenience.
It's like those bags that say, I used to be a plastic bottle. We could have a bin that said, I used to be another candle.
And then when they bring in those candles, we'll put them in another bin that says, I used to be another candle.
Yeah, and then eventually we could just have one that said, trust me, I've been other candles.
By weight, a paraffin candlestick and gasoline contain about the same amount of energy. Why don't cars run on paraffin wax? Because the inside of your car might need to look like this or like this.
What process do we run chemically based on solids? We don't. Everything we do, we use as liquids or gases because we can mix them completely. You can take a liquid, you can fully mix it. You can take a gas, you can fully mix it. You can't take a solid and fully mix it unless you turn it into a liquid or a gas.
Andrew Yang ran for America's Democratic primary in 2020, and he was constantly talking about thorium reactors on the campaign trail. If you haven't been following, Andrew Yang was one of the many candidates to lose the primary to Joe Biden.
We are working on these new generation nuclear reactors that use thorium instead of uranium.
Nuclear power, in particular thorium reactors, need to be a big part of the energy puzzle moving forward.
While his website explained he wanted to build thorium molten salt reactors. China's built one. 10 years ago, they said they were going to build one, a thorium reactor with liquid fuel. And they built it. Liquid fuel. And that whole decade, Dr. Helen Caldicott was constantly incorrectly describing the very basics of a thorium reactor.
Melting the fuel rods down in concentrated nitric acid from the thorium reactor, extracting 233, and then making more fuel rods with that and putting it in another reactor. It's economically totally out of the question.
Could you run down the arguments against thorium?
You put the spent fuel rods in concentrated nitric acid. It's too expensive to go through these steps.
There was a presentation about thorium, but they were very convincing.
Yeah, they're idiots. To produce electricity, you have to reprocess, melting the radioactive waste, then make the fuel rods with uranium-233 and put them in the reactor. It's economically totally out of this question, so these men are mad.
What is more basic than confusing solid fuel with liquid fuel, especially when your criticisms revolve around how difficult it would be to do with solid fuel? Do you power your car with a solid lump of coal or a tank of liquid gas? Caldicott might as well be going on at length about how impractical it is to own a car because you'd have to load coal into it with a shovel, and that's why nobody owns a car.
Then make the fuel rods with uranium-233 and put them in the reactor.
It's economically totally out of this question. So these men are mad. There's some sort of psychotic element in the nuclear industry, and I want to write about this, a book called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them. And it's got to do, it really does have to do with testosterone and hormone receptors in the brain and behaviour, and sex comes into it. And then you have to take that fuel and reprocess it from the thorium reactor, melt it down in concentrated nitric acid to remove this new uranium you've created to produce a functioning, fissioning nuclear reactor. That's thorium.
Mm.
It's a sort of physicist's wet dream.
That's one way to put it. A thorium reactor can be almost 100% efficient with its use of nuclear fuel. Today's reactors are 0.35% efficient with their use of uranium. That's not 35%. I'm talking 0.35% efficient, way less than a single percent. That number is so low because most reactors require enriched uranium. It's the enriched uranium in fuel rods that gets used up 5% by today's reactors. If we could be completely efficient with our nuclear fuels, then we would mine less ore and we'd produce less waste. Now, a thorium molten salt reactor isn't the only way to improve efficiencies. There's many ways to move this forward. But thorium reactors illustrate perfectly how Dr. Caldicott doesn't bother to get the basics right. Usually when she's wrong, it can be very hard to explain why. If it's not a number or it's something as simple as liquid versus solid, it's really hard for me to explain to people why what she's saying is wrong.
If you go to my webpage, helencaldicott.com, I've written an article about thorium reactors, and I've also written an article about small modular reactors.
Did you know that those subs are powered by small modular reactors? In fact, those subs can run for a decade without needing to be refueled. That's how amazingly dense nuclear fuel can be.
As Australia having probably it's the largest uranium deposit in the world, we have then a responsibility, don't we?
Yes.
Ethically and morally
Absolutely.
to the rest of the world?
Absolutely we do, Mandy. Absolutely we do. How dare we dig up uranium?
You don't have to dig it up like a coal mine where you're literally tearing apart the earth with giant claws.
There'd been a church here since the 12th century. The Garzweiler open cast mine. It is about to consume 5 more villages. More than 40 have already disappeared into its abyss.
This brown coal power station is responsible for 19 million tonnes of CO2 per year. As a single point source, 19 million tonnes of CO2 per year. And the electricity comes for a whopping 1,180 grams of greenhouse gas emissions per kilowatt hour. In the fight against climate change, places like Loy Yang are ground zero. If we aren't succeeding in driving plants like that out of our economies, we aren't succeeding at all. Follow the rail line. This 2,200 megawatt plant needs fuel, of course. The Loy Yang coal mine, where 30 million tonnes of brown coal are dug every year. That's quite a hole in the ground. If we come in a little closer, what we can see are the machines simply raking away strip after strip of land. Never to grow trees, never to host biodiversity, never to grow food. Just sacrificed in our addiction to coal. Now, there are other energy mines in Australia, of course. So let's visit a different energy mine. Let's now visit the Beverley uranium mine in my home state of South Australia. It's in a beautiful location right at the foot of the Flinders Ranges near Arkaroola, and it's absolutely teeming with wildlife. This mine, for 400 tonnes of uranium oxide per year, produces over half the energy of the 30 million tonnes of brown coal from the Loy Yang power station. And they don't even need to dig. They don't even need to remove topsoil. The incredible energy density of uranium makes it a wonderfully efficient mineral, and efficiency is good. There's no power plant here, of course. There can't be, because we're not allowed to use them. So this uranium's going somewhere else. The Qinshan nuclear power stations in China. These 2 small nuclear reactors, perched on a compact bit of land, can provide around 11 million megawatt hours of electricity per year with no greenhouse gas emissions, no particulate emissions, no emissions. Because it's not combustion. We're not burning anything. It's fission. Fission's different.
If you care about humans and you care about the environment, Why would you focus on uranium instead of coal?
We mine and sell uranium to the rest of the world. We are the third largest supplier of uranium to the global market, and we have the largest known deposits of uranium. Australia is a key player in the global nuclear cycle. And the energy in our uranium that we export every year is equivalent to Australia's total annual domestic electricity consumption without greenhouse gas emissions. That's how much clean energy we're exporting in the form of uranium oxide fuel and declining to use.
There's a lot of powerful lobby groups within the nuclear industry, very well tied into mainstream media.
Are there? I think it's a reasonable assumption for Mandy Nolan to make, but from my experience, I am not seeing it. I mean, nuclear is low carbon, but that point has not come up in this discussion because both of these people think nuclear is high carbon. That is fringe. When I first took an interest in nuclear power, believing that nuclear power is high carbon wasn't so fringy. Now, nuclear power still was low carbon. It's always been low carbon. It's just that not everyone knew it back then, or people would lie about it and they wouldn't get called out.
CO2 emissions? Ha! Not with nuclear. There's not a cleaner energy source out there.
Now calculating. Carbon footprint of nuclear is much higher than wind and solar.
Everything pales in comparison to nuclear.
Here's an example from an anti-nuclear organization calculating nuclear's carbon footprint. They said nuclear is unacceptable, so we're giving it the same carbon footprint as gas. Pulled a number out of their butts. That's how anti-nukes rolled 10 years ago. Today, they worry about the waste. They worry about safety. Every serious anti-nuclear organization, when pressed on the issue, will admit nuclear is low carbon. Here's Canada's most prominent anti-nuclear activist.
By splitting a uranium atom, you can release enormous energy. It's very compact, very powerful, and it also doesn't release carbon dioxide because you're not burning anything.
He does bring up a bunch of other issues. I fundamentally disagree with him on most things, but he is happy to admit that nuclear is low carbon because he can read. There is no serious organization saying that nuclear is high carbon because that ship has sailed right past Mandy and Helen. They perceive a pro-nuclear slant because everyone's acknowledging that nuclear is low carbon, and so it deserves to be part of the conversation. Today, most media outlets are talking about nuclear power, but not all of them.
Nuclear power is a very, very expensive way of boiling water.
I consider myself a progressive, and I watch the Rachel Maddow show. It's American news, it's pretty liberal. I watch it as a Canadian just because it's entertaining. I've been watching Rachel Maddow for 10 years, and I've never seen her explain that nuclear is low carbon. None of her guests have ever explained that nuclear is low carbon. Rachel Maddow talks about global warming all the time on her show, but this one fact has never come up. If you exclusively consume left-wing media, nuclear is low carbon is a fact you can miss. Or maybe you don't believe it because you never heard it from a trusted source. Well, Dr. James Hansen, he knows it's low carbon. IPCC, they know it's low carbon. Even Canada's most prominent anti-nuclear activist says it's low carbon.
It doesn't release carbon dioxide because you're not burning anything.
Nuclear is low carbon. This is something any green, any progressive, any liberal can Google and learn as fact. Nuclear is low carbon. Go Google it now.
We need to be provocative and make provocative statements and be provocative. I once was talking in the Herbst Lecture Theatre next to Gorbachev, who's talking, and I was talking to another group of people, and Patch Adams was there, you know, the clown?
Yeah, yeah.
And we were talking about Y2K and what could happen if the computers all went burko and we could have a nuclear war or meltdowns. And he said, I've been telling Helen since August we need to walk naked across America to get people to take note of this. And I thought, oh, God, Patch. And I went to the mic and I said, how many will walk naked out into the street? The whole theatre went up. We walked into this red velvet sort of theatre entrance and Patch took his clothes off. So I took my clothes off but left my scarf on that covered the naughty bits. And within a few minutes, everyone was naked and we started walking down Van Ness and someone started chanting, Nudes-not-nukes. Nudes-not-nukes. And guys would pull up in the car and they were clapping us, but they didn't even know why we were doing it. And when we got back, no one wanted to put their clothes on again. I was talking to the ABC on my phone, and people were so proud of themselves to have done a thing. And then we got published in the New York Times the next day.
Wow. It's powerful too, because what you show there is it's solidarity and it's the power of vulnerability against war. That's
right. And human bodies are so vulnerable, and all of them were beautiful. Tall, skinny, fat, thin. Every human body is beautiful.
It isn't meant to illustrate anything except that the conversation between Mandy and Helen wasn't just about nuclear stuff. Right? Just kind of a funny story.
I was very close to a Green candidate in Germany who was shot by her lover. Petra and I stopped Ireland getting nuclear power, and that's the first time I ever met Petra, and she was having an affair with the head of the union movement. And that's how she liked me.
This is the movie, Helen, in the mini series.
I've got lots of fun stories, I can tell you.
Caldicott claims co-credit with a German Green for having stopped Ireland from getting nuclear power. Today, Ireland continues to generate most of their electricity by burning hydrocarbons, just like my home province of Alberta.
I've got lots of fun stories, I can tell you. Like when I was speaking at the Playboy Mansion to all the film stars in Hollywood, and the other speaker was Paul Newman.
Wow.
I went to meet him, and I'd never met him before, and he kissed my hand, and I nearly fell at his feet. He was so beautiful. And I described the medical effects of nuclear war and a bomb dropping on Los Angeles and melted eyeballs and the whole thing. And I said, I want you to go out tonight and look at the stars and realize we're probably the only life in the universe. And afterwards, Chris Christopherson fell into my arms weeping, and Richard Gere was there, and he gave me $10,000. Rosie O'Donnell gave me $100,000.
Helen was raising a lot of money by scaring people about nuclear war. That's a scary topic. It does scare me still. But I think by scaring people about nuclear power, she's making a nuclear war more likely, not less. Uranium isn't rare. It can be found anywhere on Earth. We've even figured out how to extract uranium from seawater. Uranium is water soluble, and it passes from the Earth's mantle to the crust to the ocean. Every year, the ocean contains more uranium than the previous year. There is no resource constraint on nuclear power. It hardly requires any land footprint at all to generate gigawatts of reliable electricity. This German reactor, which was just shut down recently by German Greens, is the size of a hobby farm. The only constraint on the expansion of nuclear power is public acceptance. It can be cheap, it can be expensive, but there's no limit on how many we can build and run. Any country could just keep building more and more on a single tiny plot of land. We could build them right on top of coal plants and use existing transmission lines. That's what they're going to do in China. They're going to do it in Wyoming. I'd like us to do it in Alberta, and Australia could do this too. We humans can have all the electricity we want or need.
And this is a woman who says that we should be fine to study by candlelight. Beethoven and Mozart created their great works by candlelight. So why do we need electricity? Why should children need lights to study at night?
Think about it. Mozart wrote by candlelight, and so did Shakespeare. So the human race has lived for a very long time without electricity.
Mozart and Shakespeare wrote by candlelight. Ooh, candlelight? I'm writing an article for the International Herald Tribune now about the future of nuclear power, and I ended it by saying that and said, the editor wrote back and said, well, you don't want to encourage people to think they have to go to candlelight again. Well, what's wrong with candlelight?
That's right.
We're so spoiled. Don't forget, Mozart wrote by candlelight. So did Shakespeare. We've lived and survived for 3 million years without electricity. There were some Eskimos, Inuits, and they had their normal life, and they dried their fish and plaited the leather and hunted the polar bears and lived in their igloos. And then they got electricity. And then they got television. And then the young men and women left to go to a better life. And their life was destroyed. That's what I'm talking about. I was in China in '88. There wasn't a single car. There were millions of bicycles. There was one tall building in Beijing, and I said, if China goes the way of America and they all get refrigerators and cars, we've had it.
Uranium is as abundant and inexhaustible as any renewable resource. But Caldicott has told people we'll run out of uranium.
If all electricity today was generated with nuclear power, there would only be 9 years' supply of uranium left.
Just like she's told people nuclear is high carbon.
A nuclear power plant will produce the same amount of CO2 in toto as a gas-fired plant, so you may as well just use gas.
And just like she's confused people into thinking used fuel plutonium is the same as weapons-grade plutonium.
Each reactor makes 500 pounds of plutonium a year. You only need 10 pounds to make a nuclear weapon.
Pretty much every misunderstanding anyone has ever had about nuclear power has been spread at least once by Dr. Helen Caldicott, or people speaking just like her. People with no fear of being fact-checked. People with no fear of being deplatformed for spreading obvious disinformation. With Dr. Helen Caldicott and Russia Today, RT, and Sputnik, and I do think the reason Russian propaganda outlets are happy to run stories by Dr. Helen Caldicott about how terrible nuclear power is because Germany's solar and wind is backed up by coal, and is backed up by biomass, and it's backed up by Russian natural gas.
Do you want to be a democracy? And they said, yes. Well, do you want to join NATO? Yes. To join NATO, they had to spend millions of dollars investing in weapons. Now there are 30 NATO countries. These countries now are armed with American weapons facing into Russia. Imagine if the Warsaw Pact had moved into Canada and taken over the whole of the Canadian border with weapons. Putin wanted two things: not to let the Ukraine join NATO and to remove the weapons from all those new NATO countries. America could easily have done it and still could do it.
Europe is enduring an energy crisis at the exact same time Germany is shutting down their cleanest source of energy, their nuclear power plants, because they're scared of nuclear power, because they listen to people like Dr. Helen Caldicott. It's destabilizing, it's dangerous. Mandy Nolan, I'm repeating what I told you before you platformed Dr. Helen Caldicott. Dr. Helen Caldicott is not an accurate source of information on nuclear power. If you insist on platforming her, please have a fact checker on hand. George Monbiot once deferred to Caldicott on matters of nuclear power and radiation. In 2011, shortly after the Fukushima disaster and a discussion with Caldicott on Democracy Now!,
This is the biggest medical conspiracy and cover-up in the history of medicine, George.
I don't think you could dismiss the UN Scientific Committee as being part of the nuclear industry. I don't think you can dismiss the very large amount of data on the... Sorry, you're saying you would dismiss the UN Scientific Committee as being part of the nuclear industry?
Yes, let me tell you, George.
Wow. Then the mind boggles. Where does this end?
The mind does boggle.
Them and the UN Scientific Committee and the IAEA and... I mean, who else is involved in this conspiracy? We need to know.
He wrote, "The anti-nuclear movement to which I once belonged has misled the world about the impacts of radiation on human health. The claims we have made are ungrounded in science, unsupportable when challenged, and wildly wrong. We have done other people and ourselves a terrible disservice." Helen Caldicott, the world's foremost anti-nuclear campaigner, made some striking statements about the dangers of radiation. I asked for the sources. Caldicott's response has profoundly shaken me. None were scientific publications. None contained sources for the claims she made.
George Monbiot published our email exchanges on The Guardian. How dare he? So stupid. That revolting little man said after Fukushima he's become pro-nuclear. He's either got a cerebral tumour or he's had a psychotic breakdown. That's my clinical diagnosis.
I've listened to a lot of Caldicott while editing this video.
Is he being paid? I do wonder. Something fishy's going on.